So that's why firms do go into a lot of trouble to try to find their optimal capital structure. So let's suppose that the optimal capital structure, the mix of debt and equity at which you can minimize your borrowing cost, is 30%. All right, let's assume that that's the case. Now, suppose that you want to grow. You currently have assets of $1,000, and let's suppose that the growth that you want to achieve is such that it's going to imply a certain investment of fresh funds. You're going to need fresh funds. All right. Now, if currently those $1,000 of assets, how are they funded? If your optimal capital structure is 30%, then they should have been funded by, well, 30% coming from debt and 70% coming from equity. What does that mean? It means that $300 was raised from debt and $700 was raised from equity, right? The balance sheet balances, right? The assets are equal to the liability and equity. Now, suppose that you want to grow, and that growth implies that you need $200 more. In order to maintain the optimal capital structure, in order to maintain the optimal funding approach, how should you raise those extra $200? Well, those extra $200, right, which means a 20% growth, right? So here you are planning and hoping for a 20% growth. Those 200 extra dollars will have to be funded in which way? In the same way, using the optimal mix. So 30% of those $200 will have to come from debt, and 70% of those $200 will have to come from equity. What does that mean? It means that your equity needs to grow, right, from $700 to $140. Okay. Remember that I'm trying to explain why ROE is a driver of the sustainable growth rate, right? So if you want to grow at 20%, what should happen to equity? Equity should go from 70 to, you have to find some way to get 140 more dollars. Remember now, the only equity that can be used for this is equity from your own profitability, right? No new fresh funds. So your return on equity, right? How well you make your equity grow needs to be such that if you have $700 and you need to generate 140 more dollars, it means that the growth in the equity should be 20%. Notice that, so that's the ROE, right? Return on equity, growth of equity. So think about it this way: your return on equity has to be 20% so that you are able to achieve that 20% growth rate that you were hoping to generate here. So you want this growth. This is the way it should be. Let's assume for a second, just to give you again an understanding of the importance of ROE. Let's suppose that equity does not grow by the 20% that you're hoping for. Suppose equity grows only by 10%. If so, what happens? Well, you will only have $7 additional of equity in the company. And if you want to maintain the same capital structure, 30/70, what does that mean? It means that how much you can borrow is the additional funds you can borrow. In order to maintain the same 30/70 optimal capital structure, mix of debt and equity, will only have to be 30, right? I mean, you can certainly borrow more. You can borrow 40, 50, 60, 70 if you want to. You can borrow much more. But if you borrow more, then let's say if this becomes, suppose, 80, right? You can raise more funds, but if you have 80, 70, you're no longer achieving the optimal 30-70% mix. You're now borrowing much more than the optimal level, and that means that your borrowing costs are going to go up. So if you want to maintain that optimal capital structure, you're going to have to borrow only $30 that's because you were only able to generate $70 as profitability. So realize that because of this, then the only amount that you can raise will be $100. And so you can only achieve a growth of 10%. So notice that ROE is actually the what allows you or limits you in your growth possibilities, right? Now, suppose that you say, no, I want to grow at 20% no matter what. I want to get $200 extra in order to grow more aggressively, and I don't care how I need to do it. So in that scenario, what will happen? If, in spite of your equity only growing at 10%, you still want to get $200 in order to grow much more aggressively, what are you going to have to do? Well, if $70 are the only additional funds coming from retained earnings from your own profitability, then you're going to have to get the rest of the $200 from debt. So you're going to have to borrow 130. But notice that if you do that, while you will indeed raise $200, what did you just do to your capital structure? Your capital structure, instead of being 30% debt, 70% equity, as it should be, because that's the optimal level, you just became a much more levered company. Now your debt is 65% of the funds raised. So that means that you're no longer borrowing at an optimal level. Now you are too highly levered. So as you can see, right, ROE is the main driver. If you are growing beyond what you can sustain, how much can I sustain in my example here? I can only sustain a growth rate of, ROE is 10%, and if I assume that all my money is reinvested in the company, then what is my G star? My G star is, remember, G star is my retention rate, which is all my money, times my ROE, which is, in my example, is 10%. How much growth can I sustain? I can only sustain a 10% growth. If I want to grow at 20%, then what's going to happen? You're going to start, if you grow more aggressively when you can sustain, then you're going to start feeling that you start hungering for funds, right? You're not able to generate enough funding. You start seeing that your liquidity starts suffering. You start feeling like, what's going on? I'm growing, but I feel like I have less fund at my disposal. That's because you're growing beyond what you can sustain. And if you grow beyond what you can sustain, what that means is that eventually you're going to have to borrow the money, because the money is not enough coming from your own profitability. So the reason why the sustainable growth rate is so useful is that because you can look at a company's growth in sales and say, okay, how much growth can this company sustain? It can sustain only 10%. How much is it really growing at? Oh, it's growing at 30%. Oh, in that case, no wonder that you see the company maybe losing some liquidity, or the company having to lever up. It's because it's just not finding its funding through its own profitability, and so it's forced to seek those additional funds elsewhere. So this additional tool is very helpful in order to try to understand why some companies lever up, right? And many times it's because, without really knowing, people kind of say, oh, I measure the success is how much my sales are growing. Fine, you're growing your sales, but if you're not careful, there's a saying here, right? You can grow, you can go broke, or you can grow broke. Aggressive growth without being careful about how you fund may actually be to the detriment of the company. Maybe you can lever up, but that levering up may be increasing your cost of funding in such a way that you're actually losing value instead of creating value.